Okay, so we're going to go ahead and finish up these heat notes, the ones that you have so far, and then there's the rest of the heat notes are finished up in the TBL slides. And so this is just looking at what we've already talked about. We've seen this exact slide before, showing how much blood flow changes from rest down here in the blue to heavy exercise up here in the red. And you can see the asterisks here, which we mentioned before, is this is all very dependent on ambient and body temperatures. Okay, and so you can see the one that really is affected by that is right here in the skin. Skin can range from anywhere from 5% of the blood to 20%. So obviously the hotter we get, the hotter the temperature is that we're exercising in, the higher this percentage of the blood flow that goes to the skin becomes. And so we see if we take some of that, if we add more blood to the skin, these other tissues have to suffer in some way. And so we have decreases in blood flow to these other tissues in the heat because we're sending more blood to the skin to deal with the temperature increase that we have. Yeah, and so the kidneys are one of the main ones that suffer from this, and this is why exercise in the heat can result in kidney stones and things like that, is because the kidneys just kind of dry up, and some of those things that are held in solution in the urine actually are allowed to crystallize because of the lack of fluid. And so this is a nice slide that just shows the incredible amount of vascularization we have in the skin, and this is in the hypodermis as well as the dermis layers of the skin, and just lots and lots of blood flow here. And you can see here's a sweat gland, and so there's a couple of reasons that we increase blood flow to the skin. One is just to get more of that hot blood to the surface of the body so we can radiate the heat. The other is because the sweat that we create is actually extracted from the blood and from the interstitial space, and so this blood that's being sent to these vessels, some of it is being pulled, some of that plasma volume is being pulled out of that blood to get into the sweat glands to be able to be released as heat. So this is kind of the pathway that we see. We see an increase in temperature sensed by the peripheral and central receptors. This causes an increase in sympathetic nervous system stimulation, which leads to vasodilation in the vessels. And this is one key example of when sympathetic nervous system stimulation actually causes vasodilation instead of vasoconstriction. And then we have stimulation of the sweat glands and also those arterioles. And so that stimulates the sweat glands to start producing sweat and pumping it out onto the skin. And as we talked about in the quiz, these structures are much more sensitive to input from central receptors than they are from peripheral receptors. And so this question here, increased blood flow to the skin causes heat to be lost at a greater degree in which of the following ways? So yeah, that's something to kind of think about. But as you start thinking about it, obviously evaporation, because we're sweating more. That one's no problem. Radiation is definitely true too, because if we have more warm blood close to the surface of the skin, then heat radiates out of that blood. Conduction as well, because all of those tissues are touching each other. The blood is touching the vessel walls, which the vessel walls are touching connective tissue. That connective tissue is touching some other connective tissue layers, which is eventually touching the epidermis, which is eventually able to radiate heat out. So we're warming up all of those tissues via conduction, which allows us to radiate more heat. And if there's more heat on the surface, and if we're moving, then we have air moving across our bodies, and that's more convection as well. So all of these things are increased in response to having more blood flow in the skin. But we really see the majority of the improvement in heat loss happening via more sweating, more evaporation. So this is just looking at the effects of exercise in the heat versus the cold. And so, what we see here in a heat versus cold in oxygen uptake, we see greater oxygen need at the same exact intensity of exercise. Greater heart rate, the same exact intensity of exercise, okay? More lactate production at the same exact intensity of exercise, and quicker depletion of muscle glycogen. All of these things are happening due to exercise in the heat versus the cold, okay? And so one thing we can say that really summarizes this a lot is that we have exercise in the heat is more stress on the body, which is going to lead to more sympathetic nervous system stimulation. And when we do that, we are having to use more of our anaerobic systems. So that's going to be related to this one, right? More blood lactate produced, more muscle glycogen used, because anaerobic glycolysis is going to tend to use the muscle glycogen instead of blood glucose. And then because it's more stressful on the body, one, we're going to be using more type 2 fibers, and even in the type 1 fibers that we're using, the hotter those tissues are around, the hotter those fibers are, the less efficient those become, and the more of that ATP is actually lost as heat instead of being used as mechanical energy, and so we become less efficient. And then the heart rate goes up. Part of that is because of more sympathetic nervous system stimulation. Part of that is because we're losing fluid, and so we have less venous return, and so part of that is actually just sweat production and losing fluid that way, but part of it is just more blood flow in the skin and not in our central circulation, so we have less venous return. And so in order to keep cardiac output the same, stroke volume is going down, so we have to increase heart rate to account for that. Okay, so this is just looking at a kind of physiological responses, acute responses to exercise in the heat. And so the key here is that surface blood flow is increased at the expense of other tissue. Okay, so that's one thing, is we're sending more blood flow to the skin, so other tissues do not have as much blood. Okay, so, and then we also have an actual decrease in blood volume because we lose some blood volume via sweating. Okay, so this decreases cardiac efficiency, meaning that stroke volume is going down if we have less blood flow centrally, so heart rate has to go up, so it's more work on the heart. And we see cardiovascular drift, which means the longer we exercise in the heat, even if we're at the same intensity the whole time, our heart rate is slowly going up. We also see increase in oxygen uptake, increased glycogen usage, and fatigue earlier, which is all what we just talked about in the last slide as well. Okay, so as I've talked about before, and as a few of us got to see at the conference we went to up in Orange County, that the human's sweating system is far above and beyond any other animal, and so humans have somewhere around 2 to 5 million sweat glands in the skin, and sweat is mostly all water, 99% water. But if you have a situation where somebody's exercising without sweat, this is what we see. We see an increase in heat production, increase in body temperature by about 2 degrees Celsius per minute, leading to actual thermal injury in 15 to 20 minutes of exercise. And there are a couple conditions in the body where sweating isn't possible, and there are some people that have a disease that sweating doesn't happen, and they literally can't exercise for more than about 5 minutes at a time because their body cannot deal with the heat that's produced by exercise. So sweat obviously comes from the blood. We've been talking about this. The amount of sweat can be pretty extreme. Unacclimatized people can sweat up to about 1.5 liters per hour, which is still a lot. But if you're acclimatized and a heavy sweater, you can sweat up to 4 liters per hour. And remember, we only have about 6 liters of blood in the body, so this just necessitates lots and lots of fluid, taking fluid in order to compensate for this massive loss of fluid with exercise. 4 liters an hour, that's 2 liter bottles an hour. And so this is something that you can just kind of look over, and this just kind of is getting at the heart of this, how much energy we actually produce with exercise, and then how easily we can deal with this energy with sweating. And so this is just looking at a 154-pound person. Maybe they're sweating about 2 liters an hour in a hot, humid environment, but we'll say only about 1 liter of that actually gets evaporated. The other half of it gets just drips off the body and doesn't really help us cool. And so if we have this person exercising for 2.5 hours, this creates about 1,000 watts of metabolic heat production. Okay, so we have 1,000 watts of metabolic heat production we have to deal with. Okay, and so each liter of sweat evaporated per hour results in about 680 watts of heat dissipation. Okay, so that's pretty powerful. And so that's 680 watts per hour times 2.5 hours of exercise. We've actually dissipated 1,700 watts of heat, and this is definitely a believable example. But since we produced 1,000 watts of heat by the body, but this doesn't include environmental heat. So, but we've actually dissipated 1,700 watts. And so, in order to maintain core temperature with this 1,700 watts of heat dissipation, we can see how much fluid we've actually lost. And so 2.5 hours times 2 liters per hour is 5 liters of fluid lost. Okay, so 1 liter of water weight. 1 liter of water weighs about 1 kilogram. And you can see that 2.2 pounds times 5 liters is 11 pounds of water loss in the 2.5 hours, okay, which is about 7% of body weight. So in order to deal with this exercise for 2.5 hours, this 154-pound person had to lose 7% of their body weight. So obviously this necessitates a major need for fluid replacement with exercise. And this is kind of general guidelines on what occurs with percentage of body weight lost to sweat. And this is without any fluid replacement. So 2%, just a 2% decline impairs performance. 4% decreases your muscle's capacity for work. At 5%, you're getting into heat exhaustion, where you're definitely not exercising anymore. You're moving towards heat illness. And then 7%, you're starting to have CNS decline and hallucinations. 10% typically is noted the point where you're going to have circulatory collapse, where the heart can't maintain cardiac output anymore, heat stroke, and death. And one of the key things that happens while you have circulatory collapse is this fact that if stroke volume is dropping, heart rate has to go up. And so the heart is working harder and harder and harder to maintain cardiac output, like it's shown here. But at some point, this is too much stress on the heart, and you can end up having a heart attack or an arrhythmia, and leading to sudden cardiac death. And this is just looking a little bit at what can happen here. This is a study that was done back in the day when they could get people to exercise for 5 or 6 hours straight, and have them do that for research purposes. This is an incredibly intense study that these people did, but what this is showing here is 3 different conditions where at one time the person exercised and they were able to take in as much water as they wanted to. This is their heart rate. Another time they were able to get as much saline infused into their veins as necessary. Another time they had no fluid replacement, and they had them exercise for 6 hours. And you can see heart rate does slowly go up, even in the fluid replacement conditions. But without fluid replacement, you just see an absolute skyrocketing of heart rate, and they don't make it 6 hours. They only make it 5 hours. But you can see there what their heart rate should have been about 130 to maintain this intensity. Their heart rate was at about 165 by the end of 5 hours. And so just incredible cardiac stress due to this lack of fluid replacement. And obviously this is going to be coupled with a decline in physical performance. And so this slide is showing here, the more dehydrated you are, the more decline in performance you see. Okay, and so obviously we're not just losing water, and this is where companies like Gatorade make all their money. Is that there is more than just water being lost, and so one key thing that happens here in the sweat is that sweat that's on the skin is actually hypotonic, but sweat that's out down in the sweat gland, in the coil part of the sweat gland, is going to be actually isotonic or isoosmotic with the fluid, or with the interstitial fluid and with the blood. And so as sweat goes through that gland, through the duct portion of the gland, we pull back some sodium, sodium chloride, and this allows us to save some salt. And the more that we train, the more we do this. And so the more salt we save with training, and this is due to the receptors along the sides of the sweat gland ducts that become more sensitive to aldosterone. And so we reabsorb sodium and chloride, as I mentioned, and the ones that are not reabsorbed are calcium, potassium, and magnesium. But we don't really see much loss of these. And you can see that here, at least with the potassium, there's no change in the amount of potassium reabsorbed, but there is in these other ones, the amount of these electrolytes change quite a bit. So the higher sweat rates, meaning that the faster that the sweat gets pumped through those ducts, the higher rates of these electrolytes are lost, and we have less ability to reabsorb these because the sweat is pumping through so fast we can't absorb them the same. But one thing that's key about these electrolytes that are not reabsorbed is that it's only about 1% of these electrolytes that are lost. And so as far as we know, there's no effect of losing these electrolytes on performance. Now, of course, Gatorade would kind of disagree with this, and that's why they think it's so important that there's calcium and magnesium and potassium in their drinks, but there's really no solid evidence to back up the fact that if we lose these, that causes a decrease in performance. So this is just showing, we're going to talk a little bit about the things that happen when somebody gets acclimated to exercise in the heat. And what we can see here is with exercise someone who's acclimated is going to maintain a cooler core temperature longer. Obviously, this is the end goal, and also keeping cardiac stress down. So this is someone under the same condition, same amount of fluid replacement, but just someone who's acclimated in the blue, someone who's not acclimated in this purplish pink here. You can see that their heart rate stays lower and their rectal temperature stays lower, and those are the key things that we're trying to maintain and trying to get at with acclimating to the. So we'll talk about a few things that actually happen with heat acclimatization. And so one of the quickest things that happens, and a very important adaptation, is the increase in plasma volume. Okay, we saw this with endurance training, but we also see it with the adaptation to exercising in the heat. And so this happens within the first 1 to 3 days of exercise in the heat. Okay, and we can see about a 12% increase in plasma volume. And this is very, very, very important. And so the same, just like we see with aerobic endurance training, we see an increase in plasma proteins in the blood. And this allows for more water to stay in the blood because we have the higher osmotic pressure in the blood. And so the liver can upregulate the production of these plasma proteins pretty quickly in response to exercise in the heat, and this allows us to maintain more blood volume. Obviously, we just have to drink more fluids in order to give the body the fluid it needs to put this into the blood. So that one happens very quick. But we also get improvements in the sweating mechanism. Okay, and so some of the things we see sweating starting earlier in an exercise bout and at a little bit lower temperature than before. We get more sweat, and as I said, some people can sweat up to 4 liters per hour, and we get more dilute sweat. So the sweat, more of those electrolytes are pulled back in the sweat glands. And another thing that's interesting is we get sweat increases in the arms and the legs, and so this has been shown that you get more sweating on the areas that are more likely to be exposed to the air, which is really interesting and very good adaptation. The more, since there's going to be air passing over those and more convection happening there, that's going to help with evaporation, and so we get more sweating in those areas. Also, we get an increase in the blood flow to the skin. And so one of the things that we learned at the conference we went to back in October was that one thing we see in sweat glands is we actually see hypertrophy of sweat glands. And so that big coiled section of the sweat gland that you see there in the slides that shows the skin with the sweat gland, that actually increases, and we get larger sweat glands, and that's definitely related to how much sweat you can have, and also the dilute sweat too, because that we get more of the proteins there that are responsible for pulling back the sodium. So we actually can hypertrophy our sweat glands, which was something I learned at that conference, which was pretty interesting. These changes take a little bit longer. This is probably more a week and a half to 2 weeks until we start seeing this. So yeah, just to summarize that, we get the 2 major changes we see with sweating improvements are, one, we see the increase in plasma volume, which happens in 1 to 3 days, and then we see the increase in our sweating mechanism with all the changes that were listed there. That usually occurs within 10 to 14 days of exercise in the heat. Okay, and so we're going to get into fluid replacement next, and I'm going to leave this until next time. We'll start the class on Wednesday with this. All right, thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you on Wednesday.